Hello everyone and welcome to the BA Webinar Marathon. We're excited you could join us today for Rick Grantham's session, Making Informed Decisions, Guidelines for Creating an Effective Dashboard. My name is Elizabeth Jeffs and I have a few quick introduction slides before I hand over the reins to Rick. Next slide. If you require technical assistance, please type your question into the question pane located on the right side of your screen, and someone will assist you. This question pane is also where you may ask any questions throughout the session. Please feel free to enter your questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A portion of the session, I'll read your questions aloud to the speaker. You are able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the Zoom button located on the top of the presentation window. Note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to complete it. It will appear in your web browser. Next slide. If you like what you hear in these webinars, make sure to attend the PASS Business Analytics Conference taking place May 2nd to 4th in San Jose, California. With hands-on learning opportunities from data and business analytics experts and a variety of networking opportunities, the PASS Business Analytics Conference is a great opportunity to gain valuable skills and advance your career. All webinar registrants get $100 off the 2-day pass. Just use discount code BAMarathon during registration. Visit passbaconference.com to register today as the discount expires January 1st. Next slide, please. If you are interested in accessing other free educational content, the PASS organization has a variety of virtual chapters which offer free webinars to their members every month. Please check out upcoming webinars and recordings of past webinars from our Business Analytics, Excel BI, Business Intelligence, Big Data, and Cloud virtual chapters by visiting www.sqlpass.org/VC. Next slide. This BA Marathon session is presented by Rick Grantham. Rick is the Excel.TV host. He works the Six Sigma Black Belt, VMG certified, and has over 20 years of leadership positions in analytics, experience in senior data visualization, and high-end analytics and data mining. Now I'd like to present the speaker of the hour, Rick Grantham.
Hello everybody, this is Rick Grantham. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Whenever you see this slide and you see 20 years of experience in analytics positions and all of this, what I'm hoping that you're seeing from this is every way that dashboards can be done wrong, I have found a way to do it. I have found a way to be embarrassed in front of executives. I've found a way to mess up just about every way that you can mess up. So what we're going to walk through here today, in addition to sharing my screen, this is a very interactive session where I'm doing a lot of screen sharing, but in addition to that, I'm going to walk you through a lot of gotchas and a lot of things that you should avoid if you want to look the best you possibly can in front of your executives as you're building your dashboards. So today's session is making informed decisions, guidelines for creating effective dashboards. So in this session, this is not a technical session. So whenever I'm doing screen sharing to walk you through a process and to walk you through guidelines that will help to lead you through the process of gathering the most effective dashboarding requirements and creating the best dashboards possible. But for this, I am not choosing a tool in which you would build those dashboards. And so this is very tool agnostic. So we're going to provide strategies for help you determine the best way to scope your dashboard. How and when do you elicit management feedback, and doing this at the wrong time could be a bad thing. And how do you document query mockups and create dashboard prototypes? So with that in mind, let's go through a real scenario. So the agenda, we're going to go through determine the data scope, do some whiteboarding, show you what that looks like and the most appropriate time to do that. Query mockups, we'll do a little bit of prototyping, show you best practices in prototyping, and building mockups and feedback and the most appropriate time to do those. So let's go in to determine data scope. So here's a real life scenario. Now, this happens all the time. Your executives in your organization have just come back from a conference, or they've listened to this day of webinars, the marathon webinars. And by the way, they absolutely loved Rick. They loved the last session of the day. And they saw all the cool metrics, they saw all the cool tools and all the cool processes, and they're pretty excited. And as an analyst, they come to you because they know you have some reporting tools, and so they call you into the office. And they want to work with you to build some dashboards. So I guess the first question is, this is a real life scenario, happens all the time in every single organization. An executive comes back from somewhere really excited and they're ready to go and they call you into the office. So what do you do? What is your first step? What would most people do in this situation? Well, I'll tell you what I did for a number of years is I asked what they wanted. I scheduled meetings with executives and I just absolutely could not wait to get a marker in my hands and just start drawing, whiteboarding, sketching, lots of color, lots of graphics, and to kind of almost lead a design session, but I'm not really designing based on the data. I can't wait to show graphics and to be an artist. And so this is what most people do in this situation. They look at the executive and say, well, what do you want? And the executive looks back at you and says, well, what do you have? And this ends up being a very reactive way to build a dashboard. Right? You're each reacting to one another. What I want to walk you through today is how you could be proactive in this sort of a scenario to where you leave the executive's office with them having full confidence in you. So a more proactive approach would be to step one, define the data scope. I'd like to encourage you to resist the urge to start drawing. A lot of the drawing that you end up doing in that very first session ends up getting trashed. It ends up getting trashed because the executive or whoever doesn't have a real clear idea of what data is available. They don't know what data is in SAP, what's in PeopleSoft, what's in your homegrown recruiting system. They don't know how difficult it is to pull this together or the data that's available. And so resist the urge to start drawing right off the bat. Some things that you should consider. And we're going to go through a little bit of this, but what are the measures? And by measures, I mean what are the things that you would do math against? Count data, sum data, anything that you would do averages against. So what are those measures? And usually there's just a handful of those that are critical, but what are those measures? And how does the executive want to slice and dice those metrics? So these are, in the data warehousing world, would be called dimensions. And so really what you're trying to do is figure out what are the measures, and what are the key things that people are trying to slice and dice those measures by? And what system holds each piece of that data? So in defining the data scope, we'll actually show you an example of a spreadsheet that I use to do that. So as I said, it's going to be pretty hands-on. I'm going to show you exactly what I do and exactly how I do it through years of doing this wrong. So first off, you'll see that I have two tabs open here. One is called a strategic and one's called operational. And we'll get to the difference between those two as the presentation continues to evolve. But I'll tell you, for strategic dashboards, this only happens to me about 20% of the time. And this is where an executive has a pretty clear idea of the things that they want to measure, and they ensure that those dashboards and those metrics flow throughout the organization. They cascade. It's more of a balanced scorecard approach from the highest level. And in which case, there's just a few things that you really need, right? You need to walk in, you need to understand what the business name is, what system things are in, to the extent you have it, what the technical fields are, and understand if these are what kind of KPIs these are, and any sort of additional logic. Now, if you're looking at an operational dashboard, and again, we'll get into these in a lot more detail as we move forward, an operational dashboard is really where, instead of the executive driving this, you really start off with a whole bunch of existing reports, and you're trying to flow those into a dashboard, right, where there's a ton of reports already in the business, and now your executive just wants you to roll stuff up for them. And that tends to be a bit different in how you gather your data scope, because in your data scope, in this case, you already have, and these would be different reports, you already have a series of reports. And in this matrix here, what I've done is, this is all work that I would do before I ever walked into the executive's office. Before I ever walk into the executive's office, if I have an idea that they want an operational dashboard, and they're just wanting to roll things up, I would grab all of these reports, I would create this matrix, I would walk in with, here's your data that you're getting today, here's the system it's coming from, technical names if I have it, and X marks on all the different ways that things overlap, any sort of additional logic. Now, this gives me a pretty darn good idea of if a certain data element ends up not becoming available, and we'll say gender in this instance, here's some of the different reports that they're coming from to begin with, and here's how critical it might be to roll those up into a dashboard. So I would walk in with this on day one with the executive if they wanted me to come into their office. If it's more of a strategic dashboard, day one, I walk in with an annual report. So let's get back to the presentation. I'll walk you through how this comes through in real life. So that seems like a lot of work, doesn't it? It seems like a lot to do up front. And let's be honest, not every executive has the patience for a full data scope phase. There are some high-end consultants, and some of those are keynote speakers at past conferences who will not work with a company or work with an executive unless they have gone through and have done data scoping ahead of time. There are just certain ones who will not do that because it's so critical to the success. You can't really do anything until you've scoped out the data. But let's assume that you're not one of those, $500 an hour consultants, and you just got to create a dashboard. And you know that there's no way your executive is going to have patience for. Here's some of the things I would do: is I would come to the meeting prepared. All of those different data elements, I would have all of those available prior to the workshop, and I would possibly have those I would have the reports pasted up on the wall. I'd bring the available metrics during the whiteboarding session. I would post everything on the wall right next to the whiteboard where we're doing the session. And we do this so everybody stays very clear on what data elements are available, what data elements are not available, so that the conversation doesn't flow into a theoretical. Because what you're trying to do here is create a proactive session with your managers, a proactive session where you walk in, it looks like you know what you're doing. So a lower tech option is to do exactly this. So let's get into, now that you've done this, you have an idea of what data elements are available. How would you go about whiteboarding that solution? Well, first off, we did talk about this a little bit, but what type of dashboard are you building? Is it a strategic dashboard? And I call this revolution, right? This is where an executive comes in and they say, everything's going to cascade down from me. Now, there's very few people who are like this. Even in the BI space, there's very few people who are looking for revolution. What they're looking to do is, instead of create an asset, they're looking to use analytics to reduce expenses. And so as a result, most people are looking for operational dashboards. Understanding the difference between these two saves you a lot of headache. And this is from the 20 years of experience. I'm telling you that I've walked into people who were looking for operational dashboards, and I've walked in with an annual report and told them how things should cascade down, and they stopped the meeting right there. Getting this right between strategic dashboard and operational dashboard and understanding the direction you're going to go in is the way you start the entire session. So those are some of the things you need to consider to begin with. So now that you have this, let's talk about what a strategic dashboard looks like, or at least the context of it. Now, a strategic dashboard for me starts with the annual report. And in this case, we're just going to grab a department. We're saying the HR department, your HCM Global Metrics. And usually I would start this with an annual report. I would have already read the annual report. Usually in the annual report, there are items such as strategic risks that the CEO sees in the business. And so usually I go straight to those. If I was building an HR dashboard, in this case, if I was building an HR dashboard, I would go straight to the sessions where they're talking about recruiting risks that they have, or talent that they need to keep on board, or people who are at high risk of leaving the business, particularly if they're executives or if there are labor discussions that are coming up. I would bring all of those up, and those would be the beginning part of what I would walk into the executive, and I would say, okay, well, here's the strategic direction the business is going in. How can we create key KPIs that align you with the direction the organization's going? And once these KPIs are in place, we would typically create 3 or so supporting functional areas. So for the case of HR, this may be onboarding new employees. It may be the maintenance of employees. This may be offboarding employees. And here's the thing here. At this point, you'll see the word here, diagnostic reports. And what I mean by diagnostic reports, since this flows down, I can go in and pretty much predict what reports need to be created. So let's imagine scenario 1, right, where we said, okay, well, you walk into the executive's office and you said, hey, let me know what it is that you want to have on your dashboard. That's one scenario. But imagine this scenario where you've walked in and you have a list of 50 potential diagnostic reports that you believe should be, that should be there to support the functional dashboards. And here's what I mean by that. Each of these KPIs are a measure. And each of those measures can be sliced or diced by 5 or 6 or more dimensions. And once you know that, there's no reason you can't create a list of potential reports of those dimensions, of these here 12 KPIs, plus up here 16 KPIs sliced and diced by the number of dimensions you know are important. You can walk in and start to be proactive and say, here's a starter list. You tell me which ones you don't think are important. And at this time, you're creating diagnostic reports, and the reports only exist to the extent that they diagnostically tell you why a KPI was missed. So it's a very tops-down approach here. Contrast that, now this only happens about 20% of the time, but let's contrast that with what happens more frequently, which is an operational dashboard. And in this case, the session does not start with an annual report. Right? What you do is you bring the existing reports that are already out there in the business that your CFO, your CEO, or whatever department that you're looking at, whatever reports are hitting their inbox every day or on a fairly regular basis, and you take those existing reports and then from there you start building up operational dashboards. So getting this right, getting this correct right off the bat is critical. So you're going to want to bring, in this case, if you're building an operational dashboard, bring these reports with you to the first session, to your whiteboarding session. Bring these reports in because these create your basis for the dashboard. So what are some of the best practices? And we'll get into this a bit more, and we'll share some screens here, but really simplicity is key. Every dashboard, every decent dashboard, every good dashboard has typically at least these 3 elements, and they do these 3 elements well. Number 1 is number 2 is segmentation, and 3rd is criteria selection. Now, I'll share some screenshots of those in a moment, but here's some of the don'ts. Pie charts and gauges get hated on all the time, and some people will ask, well, why is that? And well, the point is, with pie charts and things like that, is you're really only getting one data point. Now, almost every executive 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whenever I first started building dashboards, that's all they wanted. Right? They wanted all the gauges, and most of your executives will probably want that too. Try to politely move them in a different direction if you can, but if not, don't say that some guy at a past BA marathon conference told them that that's the way it's supposed to be. Yeah. So try to get away from these if you can, just because they don't give a whole lot of information. All it tells you is, hey, this is in a yellow, it only gives you one data point. So let's go through some examples of what I mean by navigation, segmentation, and criteria selection. So if you go to Google, and for Google, all we did here is we just went to Google and typed in corporate dashboard. And I came over to the little images tab. So first let's talk about navigation. And you could do this on your desktop right now. So with navigation, what we mean is for all of these dashboards, for the most part, and the navigation might be in different places, but there's a navigation up at the top. To the extent that you have more data that would fit in, on one screen, there's typically be navigation across the top. And you'll see that in almost every dashboard. As we're scrolling around here, you see there's navigation across the top here, and navigation in just about all of them. Now, in some cases, the navigation is in different places. They try to find creative places to put it, but make sure that as you're whiteboarding this, that you're considering what are the critical navigation parts that your executives want to care for. Number 2 is segmentation. Now, there's a number of ways to do segmentation, but here's a few examples of it. Let's scroll down and find a good one here. segmentation is happening here, where it's very clear where, what is met by contribution margin and product line. This is maybe a little bit too simple with segmentation. Here's another one. But typically data would be segmented out so that you have a pretty clear idea of which selectors, different selectors, like for example right here there is a toggle bar for the date or for the time. And in this toggle bar, you want to make sure that it's segmented in a way that it's very clear that this does not go against the radio chart or the pie chart or any of those other charts. So segmented in a way to where different selectors, it's very clear what they stand for. So that's another thing to be cared for in your segmentation, and realize that's not always with a border and it's not always with the color of the background. In more recently, what a lot of dashboard designers are doing is using the color of the text and the color of the graph to make things very clear where segmentation is happening. So therefore creating a lot more white space in their dashboards. Lastly is criteria selection. And in criteria selection, here is, I believe, probably one right here where you can have different, maybe a bad example. Most of these in criteria selection were here like region, quote status, vertical market, salesperson, etc. So, having some sort of a selection that allows the executive to interact with the dashboard. This is where most interaction happens. It allows them to interact with the dashboard and be intellectually curious on their own without necessarily having to get an analyst involved. Let's go back. So, how do you do a query mockup, which is the next part here? So, here's what I do, and this is what becomes critical with the query mockup is this does two things for you. A query mockup is first off something that you would give to your database designer. This is your data warehouse person, the person running SQL Server for you or any other sort of data warehouse. That could be an Oracle. Any other data warehouse, but gives them an idea of the data set that you need to start with. And it also does, often you're doing this in Excel. I recommend that you develop this in a spreadsheet. It usually also gives you an idea of the data that you have available to be able to write your mock-up dashboard. So we'll show you some examples of that. For some of the benefits, it creates an initial data set, and it also gives you an idea of how the data needs to be formatted for the dashboard. So what are some examples of that? One moment. So query mockup is really no more difficult than this. Once you've already created your data elements and you have an idea of your data scope, then it's really your query mockup is given the analyst or the data warehouse person an idea of, hey, here's the sort of format that I need the data in. And once you have this in Excel, as you can see, if you're going to create an Excel mockup later on, having these data elements this way for you ends up creating a basis for your dashboard. A basis for your mockups. So Excel prototyping and feedback. So how do you transform the whiteboard into an Excel visual? I'm going to assume for the sake of argument, since we're taking a tool agnostic approach to this session and we're not building Excel dashboards per se, I'm assuming that this is not going to be in Excel, that the final dashboarding tool is not Excel. So in which case, this shouldn't be built in your dashboard yet, in your dashboard tool. There could be significant development effort to make that happen. What we're trying to do here is to create a prototype that allows your executives to take what was on the whiteboard and now start to play with it in a spreadsheet somewhere. So the prototype should combine several of the previous steps. You're going to take the whiteboarding visuals from the Excel design. You're going to take the query mockups because that's going to be your data set for your Excel visual. And the Excel prototype should provide very flexible, it should allow the executives to go in and play with the data. So a few things to consider. Number one, a few links here for you. Color theory, as you're figuring out your colors for your Excel dashboard or for your Excel prototype, consider color. Hey, color is important. Go over there to colorbrewer2.org. That's http colorbrewer2.org. Here you can play with different color palettes, and in taking those color palettes, it'll give you the hex code afterwards. And those hex codes you could very easily bring into Excel. I'd also recommend if you're looking to start designing these mock-ups or these prototypes in Excel, I can only get into so much in this hour today, but there is a YouTube channel, the Excel Kid, has a very robust and kind of easy to follow dashboard tutorial that'll show you how to make your dashboards look really cool in Excel, and probably about 7 or 8 different videos. So I'd recommend you go take a look at that. That's the Excel Kid on YouTube. Let's show you some examples. So here's an example of a dashboard built in Excel. So don't pay too much attention to the kind of the format, etc. What I want to point out to you is across the top there is navigation. There is segmentation here. So we made sure that we built in the segmentation, and we made sure that we built in selection criteria. Now, one of the things you might notice is as we're selecting different things here, I want the executive to be able to play with this. The whole point of this is them being able to play with the dashboard, to play with kind of the prototype here, and get an idea of how things will look once it's built in the tool-agnostic dashboarding tool later, right? And so you may say, well, Rick, this actually looks like there's real data behind this. How did you do this to where it looks like there's actual interactivity if you're telling me this is nothing but a prototype and there's no data behind it? Well, the way this is done is a little trick using ran between. So come over here to formulas, and then your formulas. This is where I would usually hide this before I sent it to an executive, but we'll go into any of these. And you'll see in what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, well, give me a random number between a low number and a high number. And since in this case I was adding the previous month to it in this case. But you'll see I'm using ran between. Now, the thing about ran between is anytime that there's a refresh in Excel, you see all the numbers update. So all I'm doing is going in there and I'm hitting enter. So how do you get this to refresh for you? Well, let's select in job and show you what's happening here. We'll say job 1, job 2, etc. What's actually happening behind the scenes is this is a drop down, and a drop down, we're just going to select it and we're going to move it. And you'll see what I hid behind this drop down. It just says the number 2. Well, this drop down is saying, okay, well, select the number in the list. I guess because I have all jobs, job 1, job 2, job 3. Job 3 is actually number 4 on the list, and it put the number 4 there, and which makes everything refresh. And now it just looks like everything's refreshing. So you'll need to make sure that your executives aren't thinking this is real data, realize it's just a prototype, but what it will allow them to do is now to start to play with, okay, do I really want this segment here? I know we drew it up that way, but now that I see it this way, I'm actually seeing some of the interactivity that I couldn't have seen on a whiteboard. I have a different idea of how I want to see it. I would also recommend, and this is just from doing dashboards and reporting for a long time, that whenever you roll out reports or you roll out dashboards to begin with, everybody questions your data. And it's hard to get that credibility back once you lost it. So for every dashboard I create, I always have the detail. I'm not saying you'd always put in the person's name, etc. There's certainly personally identifiable information you might not put in there, but I always have some sort of a detail or even a link to a report that has the detail on the bottom left-hand side. So there's never any question on what makes up this number. It's all in the details section, and you would see everything there for you. So this is an idea of what a prototype might look like. This is the point where now that after you've done the whiteboarding session, this is where you actually sit back down with the executive. I would actually email this out to them and allow them to play with it for a bit before you come and you sit down and you talk with them. This is an opportunity for them to provide some feedback and tell you how they want the graphs to be different than the way that you've shown them. You'll also notice one more thing, and I didn't actually build out the functionality here, but in what a lot of people do, which infuriates me, is they create, they know the executive's going to want to see a pie chart, a horizontal chart, a bar chart. They're going to want to see 8 different chart types, and you want to build in enough of that functionality as you can into your dashboards. What I do is instead of creating tab after tab after tab and creating out all these dashboards, is I'll usually create a drop-down and allow them to change the chart type and allow them to just play with that on their own. And in some cases, I'll even change the x-axis. This is the axis along the bottom. I will change that and allow them to go in and say, okay, well, I don't want to see it by country. Now I want to see it by state. And we'll allow them to completely change the bottom axes. So, there's a lot of things you could actually build out in the functionality in your prototype. So, at this time, you send the prototype to the leadership team. Here I would schedule a meeting to review the prototype and the design elements. I would review all the pictures that I took in the initial whiteboarding session. That's right, when you sit down with the executive initially and you whiteboarded everything out, I take pictures of all that stuff. And I review that whenever we're coming back with a prototype. And based on any sort of feedback you get from management, you continue to go through a cycle of making different iterations until everybody signs off on it. So, building mock-ups and feedback now that we've done our prototype. What does it look like now that you're starting to get this into a tool? Well, this is the first step that actually requires technical development effort. And I'm assuming for the sake of argument that the Excel portion of what we've done so far we wouldn't consider to be deeply technical because most analysts would be able to do that. Since this is a business analyst marathon, I think it's fair to say that most people would be able to do that. However, I'm talking about the next step. Now this needs to be developed in SSRS. It needs to be developed in some sort of dashboarding tool. And in which case, what I would do is import the query mockups into the dashboarding tool, whatever that is. I would also pass the query mockups to the database designer for the development. This means development is starting to happen at this point. I would redesign the Excel prototype in the dashboarding tool, and I would allow the leadership to test the functionality. So what is an example of that? The dashboard I'm about to show you is built in a tool called Excelsius, if you're familiar with that. One moment. So this is a dashboard that, built several years ago. See, it's dated 2001. But this is a tops-down dashboard. And so this takes into account all the design elements that I kind of talked about earlier. So first off, from a tops-down approach of a dashboard, I mentioned that you would have high-level KPIs that would cascade to lower-level KPIs that would cascade to diagnostic reports. So let's walk through how that works then. Here I have a KPI category in an index which tells me what I should pay attention to. And you'll see here I have what just looks like a trend, and it is a trend of this recruitment area. But here I have, if I click on this radio button, supporting KPIs. And so what that means is these KPIs over here have cascaded down from the recruitment section of a recruiting dashboard. But within recruiting, there's also internal movement. So as I select on that, you'll see there are a different series of KPIs now that are associated with that. And there could be effectiveness of the new hires, effectiveness of the people that you have recruited. What has that been like? And there could be a different set of key performance indicators around that. So you're getting a cascading effect here. I'll say average time to fill as an example. So now that we've done this, you may say, well, Rick, this is all fine, but it only gives me one data point or one or two data points. What happened last year? What was the trend, et cetera? But that's about it. What you'll see down here is now there are the trend charts that let me know if this has been a problem over time. So what that means is for internal movement, we have career path ratio, career path ratio. We have internal rate of hire, internal rate of hire. So we're starting to get a bit of a cascading effect where the executive is getting more and more information. Lastly, I talked about diagnostic reports. Now, in this case, these are dead links, but they're to show that reports are being developed to the extent that they support a KPI. So in this case, we have applicant ratio, which is applicant ratio here for this chart, which is up here, which supports effectiveness. Applicant ratio, in this case, by a dimension, and we'll say that's by interest group, or by functional area, or by recruiter. And you'll see all the other KPIs as well, and these would link out to reports or supporting diagnostic reports. So in this case, I built the dashboard so that all these links and all these titles would update based on whatever area. So right now we have applicant ratio, but if I click on recruitment, now that's changed. Now my diagnostic reports are external hire rate by interest group, by functional area, by recruiter, which supports external hire rate, which supports external hire rate, which supports the area. So the point is you have a completely cascading way of looking at the organization. And you may say, well, Rick, this is all fine, but it has a problem. And that problem for me is that my executive likes to play with data. He likes to slice and dice, and you're really only giving me a few things to click here. And so what we've created here also is an interactive visualization. How can your executive now play with the data and be intellectually curious on their own without necessarily needing a developer? So in this case, I want to be able to select the x-axis. So let's select the x-axis here, and we'll say we'll say offer acceptance rate. Say the y-axis, and you'll see offer acceptance rate. I updated it down here. You see there is no y-axis, so we'll select the y-axis. Say, I don't know, applicant ratio. Z is the size of the bubble. And for the size of the bubble, you really need count type data, things that you can sum up. So the number of offers, accepted, number of interviews. We'll say number of interviews, just as an example. So if you think about this sort of interactivity, what I'm doing here is I'm giving the executive 5 dimensions to play with, or five areas to play with. And here's what I mean. Across the top, they can select work contract, interest group, functional area. So they can play, this is one area they can select. Area number 2 is the x-axis. Number 3 is the y-axis. The z-axis is the 4th. And the 5th is difficult to see, but it says July 2010, which is time. And time changes as now I hit the go button. And with the go button, it says July, August, September, October. I can start to deselect things that I'm not as interested in. And this will flow real time. And if I wanted to, I'd come over to organization unit. And at this point, what you've done is you've created a tops-down dashboard, an executive level dashboard that allows them to cascade all the way through the organization, to see the supporting KPIs, to see the trends associated with that, to click on diagnostic reports if they wanted to, or if they just wanted to play a little bit, they could come over and play with the data all within the dashboard. And we'll click back one moment. So development decisions, which tool? So we just kind of walk through that. So the scenario, here's the wrap-up. This happens all the time. Your executive just came back from the past business analytics webinar marathon and saw all the cool metrics. They especially liked Rick. They know you have some reporting tools, so they call you in the office. And they want to work with you to build some dashboards. So what process do you take? Do you start off like we probably would have before this presentation and say, well, tell me what you want, and let's start drawing? Or what you could do is seem like you know what you're doing and walk in with a process of determining the data scope, whiteboarding, query mockup, realizing exactly where the feedback loops are supposed to happen until final development. So I would recommend, in 20 years of experience, that this is a fair and good process for you to follow. So a little bit more information. Where could you take this to the next level if you wanted to? I always have a KPI library in my back pocket, and it's all great to say that let's take the annual report and cascade from there, but at the end of the day, you also need to have an idea of what KPIs are usually used out there in the organization. So I do start with a KPI library. I recommend KPImegalibrary.com. It's a free online library of key performance indicators. As you start getting into your design mode for color theory, I recommend that you look at colorbrewer2.org. Also recommend that you look through the Excel Kids playlist, which I've listed here, which is good as you're starting to develop Excel prototypes. So, a few points to take home. Number one, don't design anything, unless you've completed a data scoping exercise, particularly if your executive doesn't really know what they want. Make sure that you've reined in what's possible before you start drawing, the data that you have available to you before you start drawing. Number two, data scoping exercise includes data elements matrix that should be used to determine the source of all the data required. Also, please recognize the difference between a strategic and an operational dashboard and what your executive wants. This is critical. If you're designing a strategic dashboard, walk in with an annual report, having already reviewed it and having an idea of the direction that you want to head your executive in. If it's an operational dashboard, you probably don't need the annual report quite as much as you need to gather together all of the existing reports that are out there. And I would use a color wheel to assist with any sort of color palette options. Elizabeth?
Okay, great. Thanks, Rick. We only have one question about the data scope example and whether that will be made available.
Sure. Yes, it will be made available. I can make it available not only through Pass, but also through the Excel TV website as well. So there'll be plenty of places you can get that. But everything that I've shared here today, I can make available.
Okay, excellent. Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, here's another one. How would you modify this process for those of us who don't work directly with execs, say ops managers or department managers?
I would say that how I would do that is you're less likely to walk in with an annual report, to be honest with you. Usually whenever you walk in with an annual report, you're trying to get an executive to create linkages to the executive. And that's particularly critical in things like HR, where departments are getting, say, outsourced all the time. They're just not seen as critical directions. As you're dealing with operational managers, I would tend to start with a bottoms-up approach, and I would assume an operational approach. I would assume an operational dashboard to begin with.
Okay. We have a few more coming in here. What program was the e-recruiting dashboard mock-up built in?
I built it in Excelsius. That's Xcelsius. It's now been renamed. It is an SAP product. It was built on top of Excel. And so what it did is gave you, if you look behind that dashboard, you would see Excel spreadsheets. And you'd see functions and everything else that's moving data into different places. So it's all an Excel spreadsheet in the background. So the tool that used to be called Excelsius is now called SAP Dashboards.
Okay, next one is there a book that you would recommend to master what you know? Any authors you'd recommend?
Yeah, I would recommend anything by Michael Alexander. I'd recommend anything by Jordan Goldmeyer, who's just released a Excel dashboarding book with Chandu, and I believe he was actually one of your speakers earlier today. Jordan was. I would also recommend, of course, if you're starting to get into design, I would recommend Stephen Few. There seems to be Stephen F.E.W. So he's got quite a few books out on dashboard design and when to use what type of elements and what makes the most sense and how do you get the most out of placing your dashboard designs in certain places to maximize output. So those three authors I'd recommend.
Okay, great. Here's a question, and I believe it's a follow-up to the earlier one where it's asking if you are a consultant rather than a department manager or an ops manager. Are there different questions you should start asking, or does the process change?
Yeah, if you're a consultant, you could be gone at any time. to be blunt, so I'm a consultant myself, and so I wouldn't say I would necessarily change this process. I would say that this process was built with consultants in mind, where you have to walk in and you have to act like you know and you have your stuff together from day one. And so I would say that getting that very first understanding of whether or not it's strategic or an operational dashboard is incredibly critical for a consultant walking in. They're not going to. You need to walk in and act like you've got a process down, and I believe this is a fine process for that.
Okay, great. What is the tool that you used to design your dashboard that you showed in your presentation?
Yeah, it was the same one. So that was the Excelsius tool, SAP Dashboards.
Okay. What are the best operational KPIs you would recommend for a typical operational dashboard?
Wow. So operational dashboards are all kinds of different dashboards. It could be a call center. It could be manufacturing. It could be a warehouse. So it really just depends on what type of operations. What I would recommend doing, if I was walking into organization X and I didn't know which department I was going to go into, and next I'm sitting in a session and they want KPIs, the first place I would go is I would realize what department I'm in. I would go to that KPI mega library and I would have those in my back pocket. Now in that KPI mega library, you're able to slice and dice it by different departments, by size of organizations, the type of organization you're in, so it gives you a good starter set.
Okay, and the last question we have is security and data viewing privileges. How do you address with businesses?
So usually at that point, when you're getting to that portion of it, there's usually as part of a more formal requirements. I guess we really didn't talk about security here today at all. There's almost always a concern, particularly around departments like HR and finance, as you start getting into personally identifiable information, particularly HR. You talk about salaries, social security numbers, and all that sort of stuff. So what I find is that's usually an entirely different conversation. So I'll separate it out into 3 different levels. Level number 1 is who has access to what tools within your business intelligence environment. And this is just access to be able to view, view dashboards or not view dashboards. We'll say just as an example, or the ability to drag and drop in an ad hoc environment. So that's kind of level number 1. What tools do you have access to? Level number 2, I would call object level security, right? And this is what folders do you have access to? What reports do you have access to? And so that's kind of a whole nother level of questions. And the 3rd level I would call row level security, and this is more handled in the data warehouse layer usually. And with row level security, it says that if one executive or one manager is looking at an HR report, you're running the exact same report, but he sees his data and someone else sees their data. And that's really more row level security. And by that I mean, based on who you are, you get to see different slices of the data, but you're looking at the same object. You're looking at the same report. And so I would recommend there's a conversation on all 3 of those levels because they're all managed differently. The first 2 are managed usually in the business intelligence environment. The presentation layer, what tools do you have access to and what objects do you have access to? The 3rd one, the row level security, is often more heavy into the data warehouse layer. And there's one more level of security we talk about also, is just access to the system at all. And usually this is security that's cascaded from the portal. There's some sort of portal that you're logging into, and then as you log into your corporate, your corporate environment, what sort of credentials are actually even flowed into the business intelligence environment. So there's also kind of data or access to the BI system at all. So all 4 of those need to be accounted for.
Okay, we've had a few more come in. Can you evaluate Power BI for a possible tool to use?
Oh gosh, that's a longer conversation. I'll tell you, I am in the process of kind of evaluating that myself right now, so I can't give a detailed answer on that. However, what I've seen about it so far and the opinions of people that I respect is that it's the wave of the future. And I can tell you primarily primarily in my background has been Cognos, SAP, and Microsoft as far as business intelligence tools, Oracle, etc. And I can tell you that in my mind, 5 years from now, the entire landscape is going to look different. I think Excel is going to take over the world. There's a reason that I'm involved in Excel TV. I think it's going to take over the world from a business intelligence perspective. It's already in so many people's hands, and it's just getting the tool right, getting Power BI, the desktop, and getting all those tools right. But it is the ultimate BI tool. It's in so many people's hands. It's just a matter of people understanding what the tool can do.
Okay, great. Next question is, if there is a huge data set behind a dashboard, what visualization tool do you usually use?
So I typically try to do all of my processing if there's a large data set, I'll typically try to do all of my processing before it ever hits the dashboard. And I guess there's two ways that I could understand that question. Number one would be you need to present all of that data and all of the rows of data. And if that's the case, then there's not a whole lot you could do regardless of which tool it is. I would tend to want to go to Excel or some sort of an Excel add-in because you're probably going to dump row-level type data there anyways. But if you're talking about having, I don't know, millions of rows of data and trying to aggregate that up into a KPI, or trying to aggregate that up into different categories, we'll say aggregating all of your employees up by city, just as an example, where there's a lot of aggregates that are happening. I usually recommend that as much of that you can push down to the database layer and not do it in the dashboard layer, the better. This is where you got to become really good friends. When I talked about the query mockup, you got to become really good friends with your data warehousing person and make sure they're giving you data in a way that is pre-aggregated enough for you that you're not doing a lot of that aggregation in the business intelligence tools. So I try to push as much aggregation down to the database as I can.
Okay, next question. As a consultant, where do you draw the line between adding value and creating a dashboard product that puts you out of a job?
So I don't. Everybody likes to work. I've got bills too, and so I am not. I will, as a consultant, I'm there to consult, right? I'm not there to. It's at the end of the day. I usually tell most of my clients, I say, this is your business to run. I'm here to give you, my expertise. Here's my 20 years of experience. But at the end of the day, here are my recommendations. And if you want to go a different path, then that's cool. We'll go that other path. But what they're paying me for as a consultant is to walk in with a process, to walk in with an understanding, and to be a been there, done that type of guy. Now, if they take the been there, done that guy and they just decide to go an alternate direction, then I'm fine with that too. I got bills to pay. So it doesn't really bother me at all. I just make sure that I make my opinion known. I give the reasons for my opinion, and I give examples that I've seen things happen in the past. And beyond that, if they decide to go in a different direction, that's fine with me.
Okay, so we've got the last three questions here that we'll finish up with. The first one is, are you finding businesses are now wanting more and more dashboards visible in cloud?
Yes. Oh my gosh. More and more. So I just got finished actually responding to a proposal today for a large state transportation authority here in the U.S. And they're going from building dashboards largely in an Oracle database with, I believe, Cognos on the top, to now they're saying, well, we're just frustrated with the whole thing. We don't even want to do that anymore. And so the RFP is, okay, you have to start off with either software as a service or platform as a service. We want it in the cloud. We don't want to deal with it at all. So they don't want to deal with the servers. They don't want to deal with the hassle. And to the extent they could even just subscribe to you, all the better. I worked for one of my clients was a local county government up in Georgia. And that local county government, their fire department, I was going through doing a massive assessment. for them on, should the fire department go first or the police department, et cetera, and what should their strategy be over a 3 to 5 year period. And I'll tell you that one of their departments, the fire department, said they weren't interested in being involved at all. And as we dove a little bit deeper, it's because they had just decided to subscribe to somebody who does nothing but fire department dashboards and data. You send them the data, and they will populate your dashboards, and they're only going to charge you something like $50 per firehouse. It's hard to beat that, particularly whenever departments could potentially pay for it out of their operational budget without IT almost never having to know, right? And so, yeah, I think things are moving cloud in a big way.
Okay, what are your thoughts on Tableau?
It's taken over quite a bit. I am not a Tableau expert. I heard so much about it that I've launched it. I got the subscription and kind of checked it out because I needed to be able to talk to it. But quite honestly, I'm not a Tableau expert. I haven't developed anything in it. I just know that it's becoming more and more of a requirement of companies that I talk to. I hear about it more and more often. I hear, you see it in the Gartner, them in ClickView, but just Tableau more and more. I don't have an opinion on if it's good or bad. I could just tell you there's a lot of people who think it's pretty good, and they're the people who are writing the checks right now.
Okay, and the last question that we'll have time for is, if your opinion is that Excel is going to take over the BI world, is your recommendation to wait until Power BI comes back to Excel?
Wow. No. Yeah, I think Microsoft has taken over the world. But you have a certain horizon that you have to get things done. If you got to put out a dashboard in the next 3 to 6 months, I'd probably look for the tool that allows me to do that. But I think in the future, as you get out 3 years, 5 years, it's hard for me to imagine. We'll put it this way. I run a consulting practice, or I'm the director of a consulting firm for business intelligence. Right now, as we're talking right now, I do not have Power BI people working for me. But I did have a city government in Nevada just in the last 3 months that said they wanted to roll out SAP Data Warehouse because they have the SAP ERP system, but they don't want to buy those big business objects, multi-million-dollar BI tools that go on top of it, and they're going to want to go with BI. They're going to want to go with Power BI or something like that. So it is starting to get out there, and the chant is being led by people in finance. As I went through the assessment with that county in Nevada, the Power BI questions initiated from the finance department, the budget department, the people who are taking data from the ERP systems and all the different systems, and they're downloading into Excel every single day. And man, if they could just get something that's pretty close to being free, and it just makes their life 90% easier on day one, it's hard for me to imagine a world where that doesn't proliferate through a lot of different organizations once they know about it. So I recommend not waiting if you have to build something very quick, but it's also, I realize that my business intelligence practice is going to have to change.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rick. That's all the time we have for questions now. If we provide you with the questions, will you be able to answer the remainder on a blog or tweet out some of the answers? Okay, great.
Sure.
I think there's a few slides that we'll just finish off the session with. So if you could go to the next slide. If you liked what you heard today, Rick will be presenting Build Interactive Dashboards in Excel at the PASS Business Analytics Conference. Don't forget to register with your BA Marathon discount code for savings before the beginning of January. Next slide. This BA Marathon is brought to you by PASS, a not-for-profit organization which offers year-round learning opportunities to data professionals. If you're not a member yet, join today. Membership is free. Next slide. And this concludes this edition of the BA Marathon. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the Business Analytics Conference in 2016 in San Jose. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.